I know people don't like when you make these kind of statements too early, but I genuinely think this might be the greatest comic book movie of all time. At least until the Batman comes out next March.
Differently.
Despite their mishaps and missteps along the way, DC is still keeping the train moving, and the latest movie in line is The Suicide Squad, a reboot/sequel to 2016 Suicide Squad. And this movie was written and directed by James Gunn, the director of the two Guardians of the Galaxy films, and I cannot think of a more perfect marriage between a filmmaker and a property than this movie right here. James Gunn was made for this, and only James Gunn could have made this movie, and the result left me speechless. The Suicide Squad is not only my favorite movie of the year so far, and easily the best movie I've seen in theaters this year, but it might very well be the best comic book movie of all time as it currently stands. The Suicide Squad is a movie that is everything the first one should have been, and more. This movie actually delivers on the premise of the Suicide Squad being a Suicide Squad. James Gunn put together a massive ensemble cast for this film, and the majority of them take on the role of a D-list DC comic book villain, in some case even Z-list villains, and they are all here for the sole purpose of being disposed of, because that is what the Suicide Squad is supposed to be. But even more so than delivering on the concept of this movie, James Gunn made a movie that is so wonderfully and chaotically a comic book movie that it is truly unlike anything I've ever seen before. So many filmmakers have been able to successfully translate the visual language of comic books to film, and a lot has been made about how certain filmmakers are really able to capture the essence of a comic book in a movie. But I don't think anyone has ever truly been able to take the anarchistic and freewheeling storytelling style of comic books and translate it directly to the big screen until James Gunn did it with this movie. The Suicide Squad is a DC comic book come to life, and it is absolutely beautiful. My eyes were glued to the screen for every second of this runtime, and nothing that I say in this video is going to be able to properly communicate how good this movie is and how much I loved it. My inner child was going nuts for this movie. It was a dream come true. James Gunn infuses the Suicide Squad with so much life and playfulness that it is so distinct and unlike anything we've received before this that it's hard not to get caught up in what he is doing with this movie because it is so well executed. Some people have made accusations of this movie being similar to Marvel movies, but I do not see it in the slightest, because this movie is a pure artistic expression from James Gunn, and it is very clear. Marvel movies have jokes, but rarely are they ever this loose and playful as they are in the Suicide Squad. The Suicide Squad is something uniquely its own. You can tell that this is James Gunn free of any sort of studio restraints that might be put on him by Kevin Feige or Marvel, and he went out and made the movie he wanted to make. And the result is just absolutely incredible. The Suicide Squad has so much heart, and it starts with its characters. James Gunn is able to humanize and make us sympathize with all of these D-list characters, sans Harley Quinn. Idris Elba as Bloodsport has so much gravitas and charisma that he feels like the true leader of the Suicide Squad, unlike Will Smith, who felt so forced and contrived in David Ayer's 2016 version of the movie. And of course, we have John Cena as Peacemaker, who acts as the perfect comedic and ideological foil to Idris Elba's Bloodsport, but at the same time, the two share such a similar backstory that, in a way, they act as mirrors of each other, different sides to the same coin, and this dynamic plays out through the movie. And of course, we have King Shark, who is voiced to perfection by Sylvester Stallone in what is probably his most enunciated performance in decades. And James Gunn was able to get this out of King Shark. I was so invested in King Shark as a character throughout this movie that I honestly believe had he died, I would have cried. That is how much James Gunn was able to make me care about a CGI shark. But that is the power of comic book storytelling. That is the power of good storytelling. When it is done right, you care about the characters, and what really drives the movie, what really drives a superhero story, is the characters. It has to be the characters, because the plot is always going to be a little bit bare bone. It's always going to be a little bit full of exposition at times, but you know what can make up for those is good characterizations, and that is exactly what James Gunn delivers with this movie. Daniela Melchior plays Ratcatcher 2, and she acts as this daughter figure for Idris Elba's Bloodsport, and the two have this father-daughter bond that is so believable and emotional, unlike the terrible forced daughter subplot in 2016 Suicide Squad. And of course, we have David Dastmalchian as Polka Dot Man, the infamous Batman villain that has been the subject of many jokes over the years, but he is the heart and soul of this movie. And Joel Kinnaman receives the biggest redemption I have seen in film in years as Rick Flag, because not only did I care about Rick Flag in this movie, but Joel Kinnaman was actually allowed to act this time, and his character felt like a character, not a cookie-cutter Navy SEAL type soldier. Joel Kinnaman proves why he is one of the most talented actors working today with his performance as Rick Flag, as he delivers a truly rousing performance. With such a limited and supporting role in this movie, Joel Kinnaman is somehow able to stick around in your mind long after the movie is over because of what he does with the character, because he is actually able to bring out nuances this time. Everything about this movie begins and ends with its characters. That said, the plot is simple and straight to the point, and I think that works in the movie's favor, because these kind of movies don't need to take themselves too seriously. They can address serious issues, by all means. I think the superhero genre has proven that it is the perfect medium for allegory. But they should never take themselves too seriously, because then the movie gets bogged down in a tone that ultimately doesn't fit the source material. But James Gunn knows exactly what he's working with here, and he is able to paint the picture of a very succinct and self-sufficient story, one that stands on its own. It doesn't end with a cliffhanger, it doesn't set up sequels or spin-offs or try to establish itself as being connected to a larger universe. It is its own piece of art. And perhaps the thing that stuck with me the most about this movie is the way that it is able to successfully capture the storytelling style of the comic book medium, one that's so unique and difficult to adapt, but James Gunn is able to do it with unique editing choices in this movie. James Gunn uses several establishing shots in this movie to set up either locations or headlines or various references of time, and all of these things act just as a heading would in a comic book page, and it works wonderfully. And the reason it works is because none of the characters ever break the fourth wall. They never stop and talk to the camera, they never make any jokes that are self-referential or meta, but through these unique editing and camera choices that James Gunn makes, he is able to successfully deliver us what feels like a Suicide Squad comic book brought to life. It is being presented as a comic book on the screen. It has never been done like this before, and I am absolutely blown away that it worked as well as it did. There were these incredibly inventive editing choices like Meanwhile, Operation Harley, Suicide Squad versus Starro the Conqueror at the end of the movie, and all of these things worked in a way that only comic book readers would know, and it is huge fan service, yes, but it works not only in the sense that it is translating the storytelling style, but I think it works just as a filmmaking technique for this specific movie, because this movie knows exactly what it is, and everything about it is absolutely wonderful. Everybody in the cast brings their A game, and it's clear that this movie was made with so much passion and love. James Gunn is able to get stellar performances from his main cast. Idris Elba is such a phenomenal actor that I am not sure how he hasn't reached superstar status yet. John Cena cements himself as one of the better wrestlers turned actor with incredible comedic timing. And as I said, Sylvester Stallone is able to give so much pathos to King Shark that it is absolutely shocking. Daniela Melchior as Ratcatcher 2 brings the vulnerability and the humanity to this movie, making you sympathize for this group of characters despite the fact that they're technically villains, but maybe there's some good in them. She gives us that hope, she gives us that belief, and she does so with her performance. David Dastmalchian brings this dejected, world-weary worldview to the movie, one that feels all too familiar for this genre, for audiences of this genre, but it works within the context of this movie because he is the heart of it. He is the driving force behind the emotion. And it all completely works. And perhaps the most impressive thing about the Suicide Squad is it completely avoids the third act woes, because this movie actually delivered on its premise and so many of the characters were killed off throughout the runtime. I was actually in fear for these characters' lives at the end of the movie, because if you have a movie like Justice League, for example, you know everybody's going to make it out alive, because you can't kill a Batman or a Wonder Woman. But Bloodsport or Polka Dot Man, those guys are fair game. And I was actually terrified. I felt like they were in trouble. I wasn't sure how they were going to win in this movie. And there is an incredible little detail with Starro the Conqueror in this movie that gives him such an unexpected moment of humanity that you stop and think to yourself and say, did he just say what I think he said? And yes, he did. That's the kind of thing that James Gunn brings to these movies. And perhaps the most interesting thing about the Suicide Squad is, despite the fact that the Suicide Squad is faced with this huge intergalactic threat in Starro the Conqueror, which, by the way, is such an amazing choice for a villain in a comic book movie. It's so inspired because he is the first villain that the Justice League ever fought together as a team in the comics in The Brave and the Bold, issue 28. So that's not only a fun Easter egg for fans, but it's such a worthy villain for this movie because of the kind of movie it is. But perhaps the most interesting thing and the boldest choice about the Suicide Squad is that it's really an indictment of the United States foreign policy. And that comes through not only in the central narrative, but also with Starro's character at the end of the movie. It really brings forth a lot of thought and discussion to a movie that seems to just be having really, really fun with itself on the surface. But there is so much more here. There's so much more to chew on. As I said, the characters are what drive this movie. The characters inform the plot, as it should be. But the plot itself works completely. The cinematography is outstanding because it was done on location, and you can tell how much care was put into this movie. The editing is perfect and inventive. The actors, my goodness, the performances in this movie cannot be praised enough. I've mentioned everyone that deserves praise, and trust me, I haven't forgotten. But let me just say this at the end, because we all know it, and this only reaffirms it. Margot Robbie has made the role of Harley Quinn hers. She is as perfectly suited to the character of Harley Quinn as Robert Downey Jr. was for Tony Stark and Hugh Jackman was for Wolverine. She has completely made the character her own. It belongs to her, and it's going to be very, very difficult to imagine somebody else in the role 10, 20 years from now. I do not envy the actress that has that job. The Suicide Squad left me speechless in the best way. At this point, I think it's very easy for me to say that this is in fact my favorite comic book movie of all time. And I strongly think that it's the best because it is able to deliver on so much, not only with its premise and its story, but with the characters, the editing, and the style that it brings. It's violent, it's gory, it's funny, it's charming, it's witty. It is pure comic book madness for 2 hours, all presented to us with that signature James Gunn edge. This movie is unmistakably his film, and it is unmistakably a piece of art. It's no secret that I love this genre, it's no secret that I love comic books. But let me tell you, I do not say this lightly when I say that the Suicide Squad is a masterpiece. When it comes to cape flicks, it's not going to get much better than this. And I truly mean that. And therefore, I highly recommend the Suicide Squad to everyone. I believe anyone can enjoy this movie. It is miles better than 2016 Suicide Squad. And it is, without a doubt, the best superhero project that I have seen this year. Better than any of the MCU shows, and I'm sure it's going to be better than any of the Marvel movies that will be released this year. This is a masterpiece, and I do not say that lightly. This is the rare cape flick that feels like it transcends the genre. because James Gunn just broke down the barrier of what it means to bring a comic book to life. He understands the medium and the storytelling style more than anyone that I've ever seen. James Gunn had such a unique and incredible vision, and he absolutely delivered. I highly recommend The Suicide Squad to everybody. I think there is so much to enjoy here. Whether you enjoy the technical side of filmmaking or strictly the action side, the visual side, there is something here for everyone to enjoy. You can walk away from this movie taking so much away from it. And I have so much respect for that. And it is truly the rare superhero movie that feels like it has changed the landscape of how these movies are going to be made since The Dark Knight. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope that you are all staying safe and healthy. If any of you would like to tell me how wrong I am, please feel free to do so in the comments section below. Although, I think we can have a pretty rousing discussion about why this movie is a perfect cape flick. Good night, and may your heart be your guiding key.